corridor alarm had been screaming for 11 seconds when the blast doors dropped. I know it was 11 because I was counting. 40 years of military habit. When something goes wrong, you count, you name the seconds. You do not panic inside the count. Count is the only thing you control, so you hold it like a hand grip and you do not let go. At second 11, 260 kilograms of reinforced laminate slammed down from the ceiling of Corridor 7 Bravo aboard the diplomatic vessel Unbroken. Vale and the last 4 members of the Thesauri Honor Guard disappeared behind it in a scramble of gilded boots and shouted orders. They made it through. I did not. I had stopped to pick up the Queen. She had stumbled at second 9, her left ankle turning on a loose floor plate, a kind of stupid maintenance failure that doesn't get logged on a vessel this prestigious because nobody admits to it until something goes wrong. Tendant, a young Thesauri, male with more ceremony than sense, had grabbed her arm for exactly 2 seconds and then, when the alarm pitch changed and the overhead lights went red, he had let go and run. He had let go of his Queen. I watched him do it. I watched him not look back. Her name was Thisarvel Sorath, and she was the sovereign of a dead empire that still mattered, and she was on one knee in the middle of a sealed corridor with her ankle at a bad angle, and her composure held together by nothing but 30 years. Practice stillness. I was behind her. I was always behind her. That was my assignment. Warrant Officer Callum Veth, Terran Diplomatic Escort Corps, 3rd rotation in the Outer Systems, technically on loan to the Thesauri delegation for the duration of the summit. My job was to stand behind the Queen in formal settings and look like I was part of the furniture and to intervene if someone came at her with bad intentions. Nobody had briefed me about what to do when the blast doors came down and everybody else ran. I got under her arm and pulled her upright, and the door hit the floor behind us, and that was that. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. I could feel her steadying herself, redistributing her weight off the bad ankle, calibrating with the same precise efficiency she brought to every other thing she did. The red alarm lights painted the corridor in alternating crimson and shadow. The screaming klaxon cut off mid-cycle was somehow worse than the noise. Then the ship's automated systems activated, and a voice, flat, calm, without any of the drama the situation deserved, said, "Biological contaminant protocol initiated. Sector 7 Bravo is under Class 4 quarantine seal. All personnel within the sealed sector are to remain in place. Quarantine enforcement duration, indefinite. Medical assessment teams will arrive when corridor breach risk is deemed acceptable. Thank you for your cooperation. Thank you for your cooperation." I had spent 22 years in uniform, and I had heard a lot of military, bureaucratic understatement, but that particular piece of phrasing hit a new high. Thisarvel Sorath turned and looked at me. Eyes were the deep amber gold of old honey. The irises ringed in a thin line of darker bronze, and they were absolutely level, not panicked, not grateful. She was assessing me the way she assessed everything, measuring the quality of a thing before she decided how to use it. "Did not run," she said. "No, ma'am, you had time. I had time." She studied for another moment. Why? It was a genuine question. She wasn't being rhetorical, and she wasn't being gracious. She wanted an actual answer, and she was going to measure that answer against something internal I would never fully see. I told her the truth. "You were on the floor. I don't leave people on the floor." Something shifted in her face. Not much. A slight loosening around the eyes, fraction of a degree in the set of her mouth. She had spent long enough in diplomatic chambers that her face was a controlled instrument. Something in my answer had landed differently than she expected, and for just a second it showed. "That is a very simple reason," she said. "Most of mine are." She absorbed that. Then she straightened to her full height, adjusted the collar of her ceremonial overrobe, deep burgundy, the silver threadwork that indicated sovereign rank, and said, "Then I suggest we determine our situation, Warrant Officer." She had not asked my rank. She had read my insignia in the 2 seconds she had spent looking at me, filed it away, and used it without ceremony. That was the first thing I learned about her. The second thing I learned was that she did not waste breath on what couldn't be changed. Port had run. The blast door had sealed. There was presumably a biological contaminant detected somewhere in this section of the ship, and we were behind the wall that separated the quarantine zone from everything else. She did not spend a single second on any of that. She moved past it like it was weather. Already done, already accounted for. And started asking me what I knew about the ship's layout. I knew some of it, not enough. I had the section schematic from my pre-mission briefing, covered the formal reception areas, and the route to the emergency evacuation pods. But not the engineering sections, not the maintenance corridors, and not, as she immediately identified, the location of the ship's biological scanning equipment, which was apparently something she needed to reach. The protocol will not lift until a second scan confirms no contamination, she told me. First scan was a flag, not a verdict. I need to reach the medical bay in this section. You know the protocol? I wrote the thesauri equivalent of it 40 years ago. She glanced at me sideways. I was not always a queen. She had been something else before. Filed that away. And didn't ask. We started moving. The sealed sector was longer than I'd expected from the schematics. Corridor 7 Bravo. Part of the unbroken veil's midship diplomatic spine. A stretch of vessel that served 3 different delegation suites and connected the formal reception hall to the auxiliary conference chambers. Under normal conditions, it would have been busy. Under emergency lighting with the blast doors down, it felt like the kind of dream where a familiar place becomes unfamiliar. The same proportions, shapes, all the warmth drained out. We moved carefully. She kept her weight off the bad ankle, but she didn't lean on me. I offered my arm once, and she looked at it and then at the corridor ahead and chose the corridor. I didn't offer again. She was not a person who accepted assistance as a default condition, and forcing it would have been an insult. I took point anyway, not obviously, not as a statement, just as a natural function of being the one with tactical training and the one who was not injured. I watched the corridor ahead, while she watched my peripheral cues, and we moved in the kind of unconscious coordination that forms between people who both understand situational awareness without having to discuss it. The corridor was a long, windowless tube of the kind that exists on every diplomatic vessel in the known systems, designed to look impressive at the entry points and progressively less so as you work toward the utilities. Emergency lighting gave everything the quality of an old photograph. The ship's gravity was holding steady, which was one thing in our favor. We found a communication panel at the 40-meter mark, a standard ship-to-control interface, the kind that's supposed to provide sealed sector occupants with a line to the bridge. I tried it. It gave me a pre-recorded message about the quarantine protocol and a reference number I could use to file a status report when the seal lifted. I stood there for a moment with my hand on the panel. They've automated the response, Tessera said from behind me. It was not a criticism, purely observational. Apparently, it is a common design choice. Reduces the risk of human error during a containment event. Also, reduces the risk of someone with authority talking you out of a protocol they consider politically inconvenient. I looked at her. Quarantine seals have been used before as instruments of political convenience, she said, the absolute calm of someone recounting established fact. Twice in thesauri history, once in Vareth space, 40 years ago. The automated response architecture was developed specifically to prevent that use case. Does it work? Prevents the seal from being lifted by pressure. It does not prevent the seal from being initiated by pressure. She looked at the panel. First scan that flagged this section, someone requested it. That is not standard procedure. Standard procedure is passive monitoring. An active scan of this corridor would have required a manual initiation. I turned to look at her fully. You think someone put the seal on deliberately? I think someone requested a targeted scan of a corridor that contained me, a section I was passing through at a time they would have known from the schedule. She held my gaze. I do not know whether they knew what the scan would find, or whether they were simply hoping to disrupt the proceedings. Either way, result was the same. Who? I have 3 candidates. I have had 3 candidates in this negotiation for 11 years. She turned away from the panel. None of them matter right now. What matters is finding the secondary medical station and the scanner we need. Dret's motives when the door is open. She was right. I filed the information away with the same thoroughness I gave everything she said, and we kept moving. We passed 2 sealed rooms before I found the door I was looking for, a maintenance hatch marked with the stylized medical cross that the unbroken veil used for its secondary medical stations. The lock was a standard shipboard tumbler, the kind that defaults to open during an emergency. But the emergency protocol had apparently reclassified the quarantine as a reason to stay locked. I stood looking at it for a few seconds. "Can you open it?" she asked. "I'm thinking about it." "You are staring at it. That is what thinking looks like from the outside." I unslung the utility kit from my hip and started working the panel. She did not offer to help, which I appreciated. She also did not tell me to hurry, which I appreciated more. It took 6 minutes. The lock was not designed to resist a determined person with the right tools and no time pressure. It was designed to resist accidental activation and casual tampering. I got through it, and the door slid back into its recess, and we went in. The secondary medical station was a room about the size of a generous closet. 2 examination platforms, a diagnostic console, a sealed cabinet of supplies, and a scanning arch that hung from the ceiling like a ribcage made of dark metal. The station was cold and smelled of recycled air and antiseptic. No one had been in here recently. Thessera went directly to the scanning arch without being asked. She stood under it, adjusted her posture to something that suggested she had done this before, and looked at me. "The activation panel is on the left side of the console. You know this equipment." "I know all medical scanning equipment that has been in use in the outer systems in the last 40 years. She paused. "That is not a boast. It was necessary to know." I found the panel and activated it. The arch hummed. A field of soft blue light swept down from the top of the arch to the bottom, the kind of slow, deliberate scan that gathers everything and says nothing for a moment. And then, the console produced a readout I couldn't parse. She could. She leaned forward over the secondary display, a small screen on the arm of the arch itself, and read it with the same focused stillness she brought to everything. A long moment passed. Then she made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, more like something released. "It is what I suspected," she said. "Tell me." The first scanner read my royal bloodline marker as a biological contaminant. It is an old flag. The Thessori sovereign line carries a genetic sequence from the foundation of our species' first spacefaring era, very old modification that no longer exists in the general population. To a scanner calibrated for modern biology, it presents as an unknown organism. She touched the small screen. "This scanner is newer. It identifies the sequence correctly. There is no contamination. There never was. The whole quarantine, the blast doors, the alarm, the evacuation of her court, had been triggered by the fact that she was who she was, by a bloodline so old the modern equipment read it as a threat. Can you transmit the corrected reading to the ship's main system? From here? No. I would need access to the main medical bay, or the ship's communications array. Both are outside this section." She straightened. "Which means we wait for the assessment team to arrive with their own equipment, at which point the error will be identified and the seal will lift." "How long?" "On a vessel of this class with a Class 4 seal, the assessment team will not enter until the quarantine monitor has held a steady, no flag reading for 4 hours. After the seal drops on side, they will spend approximately 2 hours preparing for entry." She looked at me with those level amber eyes. "We have 6 hours, Warrant Officer, possibly more. 6 hours, sealed in a medical closet with an injured queen, no external communications, and a stack of emergency rations I hadn't checked yet." I checked them. There were enough. There was water. There was a basic med kit, which was more relevant than the rations at the moment. "May I look at your ankle?" I asked. She regarded me for a moment, measuring again. Then she sat on the nearest examination platform, extended her left leg, and let me work. The ankle was swollen but not broken. A moderate sprain, the kind that hurts considerably but doesn't require more than support and rest. I wrapped it from the medkit supplies. She watched me do it with the focused attention she seemed to bring to everything, and when I was done she said nothing for a moment. "You have done that before," she said. "Medic training. 20 years ago, but it holds. You were a medic. Trained. Started as infantry, the Corps cross-trains everyone in a second specialty." I sat back on my heels and looked up at her. Figured it was more useful than artillery. "Why?" "Because artillery tells you something went wrong before it started. A medic is useful after." She looked at me for a long moment. That is also a very simple reason. I told you how mine work. I set the kit aside and straightened up, and she tested the wrap with a slight shift of her weight. And then she looked at me directly, with the kind of gaze that had stopped moving around the room and was now specifically and completely on me. Who are you precisely, she said. I told you. Callum Veth Terran Diplomatic Escort Corps. That is your designation. I asked who you are. I thought about that. I grew up in a timber city on the coast. My grandfather was a night watchman. My mother taught science at the secondary level. I've been in uniform since I was 20. I've done escort duty in the outer systems for 7 years. I looked at her. I don't have a great deal of personal mythology. No, she said. You have something rarer than that. She seemed to be choosing her next words with care. You have a consistent character. Spent 11 years in this negotiation watching delegation personnel whose behavior shifts depending on who is observing them. You behave identically, whether you are standing behind me in a formal chamber or alone with me in a sealed room. I'm not performing anything. I said that, she said, is exactly what I mean. The seal held. We waited. We did not fill the silence with noise. She was not a person who required it, and neither am I. But the silence was not empty. It had texture, the way silences do between two people who are paying attention to each other without performing the act of paying attention. After about an hour, she asked me where I grew up, and I told her the short version, the timber city, the fish smell in summer, particular quality of gray winter light on the coast. And she listened to it the way she listened to everything. Completely. Interruption. When I finished, she said, I have never been to Earth. Most people haven't. It is strange. Produces a disproportionate number of the personnel I encounter in settings like this. Military escorts, diplomatic liaisons, trade representatives. You are everywhere in the outer systems. We're curious, I said. We've only had interstellar capacity for about 150 years. Everything is still new to us. The Sauri have had it for 9,000. She said it without pride, more like stating the color of a wall. I sometimes find it difficult to remember what new feels like. Does it feel like anything? She considered that longer than I expected. It feels like the possibility that you might be wrong about something you were certain of. She looked at the scanner arch. Today, for instance, I was certain the court would not leave. I have maintained this delegation for 11 years. I believed I knew each of them. There was nothing in her voice that I would have called self-pity. It was more clinical than that. An analysis of a variable that had behaved outside its predicted range and a quiet acknowledgement that the model needed updating. They were scared, I said. They were scared, she agreed. Fear is a valid datum. I do not hold it against them. A pause. I am noting it, however. I thought about that. There's a difference between fear and choosing the door over the person you're supposed to protect. She looked at me. Yes, she said. There is. She was quiet for a while after that, and I could tell she was working something through. Not processing the fear. She had already done that in the corridor. In the first minutes, after the door came down. Something older. Something she had been working on for longer than today. My court, she said, finally, has served me for a combined total of approximately 260 years. Individual members for as few as 3 and as many as 27. They are competent, loyal by their own understanding of the word, and completely accustomed to the idea that their primary function is to be seen, adjacent to me in formal settings. She looked at the floor. None of them have ever been in a situation where I needed them rather than the other way around. Until today. Until today. She raised her eyes. I had not thought carefully about that discrepancy. I had assumed that loyalty in the formal setting translated to loyalty under pressure. This was an error. You didn't know until you did. That is true of most errors. She looked at me with something in those amber eyes that was, I was beginning to understand, form of humor, dry as old stone, almost invisible unless you were watching for it. It does not make the error less informative. No, I agreed. It makes it more. We didn't talk for a while after that. I ran a slow check of the room's systems. The station had emergency power. The ventilation was cycling correctly. The temperature was holding steady. There was nothing threatening about our immediate environment. The danger, such as it was entirely administrative. A quarantine protocol that didn't know what it was looking at. Ship full of people on the other side of a blast door who probably had no idea that their response team would show up and find nothing wrong. Somewhere in the second hour, I found a packet of something in the supply cabinet that turned out to be a thesaury ration. Compressed, rectangular, the deep rust red of dried grain. I held it up and looked at her. "Is this edible for me?" She tilted her head slightly. "Protein matrix is compatible with Terran biology. The flavor has been described by human personnel as aggressive." I opened it. It tasted like salt and iron, and something that might have been a seed-based vinegar, and it was substantially better than most field rations I'd consumed in 22 years of service. "It's not bad," I said. Something shifted in her expression. A slight elevation at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile, but was in the same postal district. Sorev described it as tasting like the inside of a gauntlet. Sorev has had worse gauntlets than I have then. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "Hand me one." I did. She ate it without ceremony, seated on the examination platform with a piece of emergency rations, the sovereign of a 9,000-year civilization, in an unlocked maintenance station. And she looked completely untroubled by the situation, performing ease, simply possessing it. Somewhere in the second hour and a half, she told me, without much preamble, about the 3 candidates she had named earlier, the ones she believed responsible for the targeted scan. She did not name them directly, not then. She described them by their behaviors. The negotiator who had a habit of requesting procedural delays at key moments. The bloc representative who had blocked 2 previous survey proposals without stated reason. The aide who had asked her itinerary 4 times in the 2 days before the summit. And she laid it out with the clean analytical economy of someone who had been thinking about this for a long time. I listened without interrupting. When she was done, I said, "Does any of it matter right now? For what you're trying to do?" She thought about it. "No. The mechanism of how the seal was initiated changes nothing about how it lifts. And the report you are filing documents the technical cause, not the political one." She paused. "If the political cause is provable, and I believe it is, that is a separate document, a separate process, and a separate set of consequences. Pursue it. In due course." I have pursued similar matters before. The result is generally a combination of formal censure, quiet reassignment, and a period of heightened caution from the parties involved. She looked at the wall. "It does not change the fundamental landscape. People who are threatened by what I am doing will continue to be threatened by what I am doing. The names change. The behavior does not. That's a long view to hold. It is the only view available when you have been at this for 40 years. She looked back at me. "I would prefer the short view. I would prefer that people behaved differently, and that the landscape changed in meaningful ways, and that the next 40 years were less repetitive than the last 40. But I work with the world I have, not the world I want. Is that discouraging?" She considered the question seriously, turning it over. "It was once, when I was younger, and I believed that the right argument delivered with sufficient clarity would change a position. I spent a great deal of energy on that belief before I understood that positions rarely change for argumentative reasons. They change because the cost of maintaining them exceeds the cost of shifting them." She glanced at me. "Report you are filing will change the cost calculation for everyone opposing the survey. That is more durable than any argument." I thought about that. "You figured this out in year 4 of the negotiation, or year 8. Year 2, she said. "The application has taken longer." At the 3-hour mark, she asked me something I hadn't expected. "Do you know what the Veth name means? In Old Terran language?" I looked up from the equipment check I was running. "My family name?" "Yes, I researched the people assigned to my delegation, a habit I developed early." She did not sound apologetic about it. "In the old Northern Terran language families, the ones that gave the suffix eth to many occupational names, Veth indicated a particular kind of work. I didn't know that. The word meant the one who stays at the wall." She watched my face. "A guard, but specifically a guard who remained at a post when others retreated. Not because they were ordered to, because they considered it correct." I didn't say anything for a moment. The emergency lighting hummed very faintly, subsonic frequency you feel more than hear. My grandfather used to say that our family were stubborn people, I said finally. He was correct. There was something in her voice that wasn't quite warmth. It was closer to recognition. The sound of a person identifying a quality they had thought rare, finding it present. He was very correct. She looked at me for a while after that, not speaking, and I let her look. I wasn't uncomfortable with it. She was a person who measured things carefully before she trusted them, and measuring took time, and I had 6 hours with nowhere else to be. You are not curious about me, she said eventually. I'm curious about a great deal. I just don't ask unless I think it's my business. Most people are curious about the Queen. The title functions as a kind of magnet for questions. I'm curious about you, I said, not the title. But what you think about things, how you reason through them, that seems like your business until you choose to share it. She was quiet for a moment. Then, that is an unusual distinction. Is it? In my experience, yes. Most people treat the person and the position as the same object. They're not. No, she said, they are not. The 4th hour was the hardest. Not because anything went wrong, nothing went wrong. Somewhere around the halfway point of a long wait, the mind runs out of useful things to do and starts making room for the things you've been holding at arm's length. I'd been keeping a clean operational focus for 3 hours, which is sustainable, but at hour 4 the focus starts to cost something. I was thinking about the court running. Not judging it, she was right. Fear is a datum. But sitting with the image of that young attendant letting go of her arm. 2 seconds he held on, and the single second he chose the door. I'd seen it in combat, that same arithmetic. The moment when the survival calculation completes, and the body moves before the person finishes deciding. I didn't find it monstrous. I just found it very, very clear. She was sitting on the examination platform with her back against the wall, her wrapped ankle extended, reading something on the small screen of a device she had produced from the inside pocket of her overrobe. I had not asked what she was reading. It was none of my business, and she had not offered. But at the 4-hour mark she lowered the device and said, "You are thinking about something. Am I showing it? You have a particular stillness when you are thinking. It is different from your operational stillness. More internal." I looked at her. "You notice a lot." "I notice everything. It is how I have survived 40 years of thesauri court politics." She said it without drama. "What are you thinking about?" "The attendant. The one who let go." She was quiet for a moment. "Sarav, that's his name? He has served me for 6 years. He is 23. He has a son." She looked at the opposite wall. "He will be devastated when he understands what he did. That is not a small thing to carry. You're not angry at him." I was briefly. For approximately 40 seconds, she glanced at me, with something in those amber eyes that I was starting to learn how to read, a slight levity underneath the control. Then I calculated what anger would accomplish, and the figure was 0, so I stopped. I almost smiled. That's an efficient approach. 9,000 years of interstellar civilization produces efficient approaches to most things. She paused. "Though I will admit that your approach to the lock was also efficient, and your civilization is considerably younger. We learned from watching everyone else's mistakes. The young always believe that." She tilted her head slightly, but occasionally it is true. Outside the sealed corridor, beyond the blast door, and the quarantine perimeter, and whatever controlled chaos was happening on the rest of the ship, I could hear nothing. The unbroken veil's construction was too solid, the seal too complete. We might have been the only 2 people in this section of the universe, sealed in a cold room under red emergency light, waiting for a machine somewhere to finish counting. I thought about the summit, the reason we were all here. 3 systems, 5 delegations, treaty negotiation that had been stalled for 8 years over mineral rights in a belt nobody had surveyed properly. Professor Fulsorath had been the most senior delegation leader at the table, and, by all accounts, the most difficult to argue with. Not because she was unreasonable, because she never lost track of a single fact she had ever been given. You couldn't revise history in her presence. She had filed it all away. I wondered how many of the other delegation leaders knew the person I was sitting with. Not the Queen, not the negotiator. The person who, at the 4-hour mark of an unexpected quarantine seal, asked what you were thinking about. "Can I ask you something?" I said. You have been asking me things for 4 hours. Something different, she waited. The summit, the mineral treaty. You've been in this negotiation for 8 years. I chose my words carefully. What do you actually want? Not what Thesser needs, what you want. Question surprised her. I could see it. A genuine flicker of something unguarded crossing her face before the control resettled. She looked at me for a long moment and, for the first time since the blast door had dropped, she seemed to be deciding something. I want the belt surveyed properly, she said. Not for the minerals. I want it surveyed because 1100 years ago, Thesori deep-range vessel disappeared in that system. And no one has ever looked for it carefully. The treaty gives whoever controls the extraction rights the jurisdictional authority to commission independent surveys. A pause. I have been negotiating for 8 years for the right to look for a ship. I sat with that. Does anyone on your delegation know that? No. Why tell me? She looked at me with those level amber gold eyes, and this time what I read in them was something I hadn't expected to find. Kind of tiredness. Not exhaustion. Nothing so commonplace. More like the weight of a very long time spent, being the only person who held certain things. Because, she said, you are the only person in this room, and you asked me a real question. And I have not been asked a real question in rather a long time. I did not know what to do with that, so I did the only thing that seemed right. I stayed where I was, and I did not look away from her, and I said, the ship, 1100 years, what was it called? And she told me, and we talked about it for an hour and a half. She told me what the record said, fragmentary, incomplete, reconstructed from 3 different archival sources, about a vessel called the scifi, a deep-range explorer commissioned in the early expansion era, crewed by 47, last logged contact in the outer belt of the system now under dispute. The Soreth name, the same name as her own lineage, her family's ship, the founding expedition that had placed the first way markers in that system 9 centuries before anyone had thought to argue about what was underneath the ice. She told me about the 3 previous times she had tried to commission an independent survey through diplomatic channels, previous times. Those efforts had been absorbed into procedural delay and countermanded by block interests that had nothing to do with history and everything to do with cutting the Thesori out of whatever was down there. She told me about the genetic sequence, the old modification, that the scanner had flagged as a contaminant. Modification one had been in standard among the early expansion crews, when long-range travel required certain biological adaptations that the modern population no longer needed, the sequence that marked her as direct-line descendant from the founding era. The ship's crew carried that modification, she said, 47 of them. Whatever is left out there, if there is anything, it carries the same flag. If anyone ever finds it and scans it without knowing what they're looking at, the equipment will tell them it's contaminated. I thought about the ship's quarantine protocol. The scanner reading her bloodline as unknown organism, the blast doors dropping, her court running. Protocol was written for modern biology, I said slowly. Yes, and you, genetically, are ancient biology, in the most literal sense. Faint dry note in her voice. I am, to a medical scanner, 1100 years old, and the ship out there, if someone found it and scanned for life signs or organic material, the scanner would flag it as contamination and the protocol would seal the corridor and the assessment team would show up and find nothing wrong. She looked at me. You understand now. You've been trying to get to that ship for 8 years. And every channel that leads to it is the same system that would flag the search as a contamination event and shut it down. Every automated system, every treaty protocol, every mineral rights framework. Voice was quiet and controlled and absolutely level. The galaxy's bureaucracy is very good at not finding things it has not been told to expect. I was quiet for a moment. The new scanner here, I said. The one that read your bloodline correctly. What model is it? She told me. Check out my personal comm. No external signal in the sealed section, but local storage was intact, and wrote it down. When this seal lifts, I said, I'm going to file an incident report on the quarantine event. That's standard procedure. The report will include the scanning discrepancy. The difference between the ship's primary scanner and this station's secondary scanner, with equipment model numbers and the nature of the flagged sequence. I looked at her. That report goes to the Terran Diplomatic Corps Records Office, which archives it, which means it becomes an accessible document in the Inter-System Treaty Database. She was watching me very carefully. A document in the treaty database, I continued, is citable by any party in an active negotiation, including yours, including as evidence that existing treaty protocols contain a technological deficiency that causes them to misclassify objects of thesauri, historical significance as biological hazards. Her eyes were very still. Which means, I said, that you have a procedural avenue to demand a protocol review as a precondition for treaty ratification. A protocol review that, if it goes the way the evidence says it should, would require any mineral extraction framework to include provisions for historical survey of objects, flagged by legacy genetic sequences. I paused. Which gives you your survey rights, not through the mineral rights argument, through an equipment standards argument. She did not say anything for a long moment. You would do this, she said. It was not a question, but it also wasn't entirely certain. There was something in it that was still testing, still measuring. It's an accurate report, I said. Everything in it happened. I'm required to file it. I just need to make sure I file it completely. You would not have thought of this, she said carefully, if I had not told you about the ship. No. So you are using information I told you in confidence. You didn't tell me it was in confidence. You told me it because I asked a real question. I held her gaze, and I'm not using it against you. I'm filing a report that documents something real, that happened to us, that happens to create a pathway for something you need. The information I'm acting on is the scanning discrepancy. I'd have noticed that regardless. She studied me for what felt like a full minute. You are a very precise thinker, she said, for someone who claims to work in simple reasons. The reasons are simple. Thinking is just thorough. Something moved across her face. Not the controlled instrument of the Queen. Something underneath it, warmer and less managed. Her eyes had gone slightly liquid at the edges, the way they go when a person has been holding something for a long time and a door opens somewhere unexpected. The Sorath's Eye, she said, very quietly. 47 crew, 900 years gone. She looked at the floor of the medical station, the scuffed gray metal that looked like the floor of every secondary station on every diplomatic vessel in the system. I have wanted to find them for 30 years. Tell me why, I said, the real reason. And again she looked at me with the question she kept asking without words. The one that asked whether I was what I appeared to be, whether I could be trusted with a real answer. And again, something in my face apparently answered it. Because she took a slow breath and said, my mother's mother was the last direct descendant of the expedition's commander. She told me about the eye when I was 7 years old. She had a fragment of the ship's registration seal, a piece of metal about this size. She shaped a rectangle with her fingers. That had been handed down through the family since the loss. When she died, she gave it to me. Her hands returned to her lap. I still carry it. She reached into the inside pocket of her overrobe and produced a piece of metal about the size of a playing card. Dark, slightly corroded at the edges, with the impression of a symbol. 2 concentric circles with a line through the center, stamped in its surface. She held it between her fingers for a moment, and then set it on the examination platform beside her. I looked at it for a while. When you get the survey rights, I said, and when they find the ship, what will you do? Bring them home, she said simply. The records. Ever is left of the crew's personal effects. The log, if the log has survived. Bring them back to Thesar and give them a ceremony and a name and a date. She looked at the metal fragment. Shh. They went into deep space in the founding era and they did not come back, and no one has said their names officially in 900 years. That is too long to be lost. I thought about that, about the specific weight of being lost for 900 years. A piece of metal handed down through 6 generations of a family, from a grandmother to a 7-year-old, crossed the length of an empire that had lived and diminished and survived. They'll be found, I said. She looked at me. Port I'm filing is accurate and it's airtight. The equipment discrepancy is documented. Your legal team will know what to do with it. I held her gaze. They'll be found. She did not say anything, but she picked up the metal fragment and held it for a moment, and then she put it back in her pocket, and the way she did it was different from the way she had taken it out. more settled, somehow, as if it weighed slightly less. The fifth hour we spent mostly in silence, but it was a different silence, the kind that exists between people who have said something real and are sitting with it, not fill in the space, but inhabiting it. She returned to her reading. I ran another systems check, found everything unchanged, and sat down with my back against the wall, across from her, and let the time pass. I thought about what it meant to carry something for 30 years, not the abstract meaning of it, the specific physical fact of it. The weight of a piece of metal in a pocket, worn smooth at the edges from handling, the habit of reaching for it and not reaching for it, knowing it was there, particular discipline of keeping a private grief, private, when the whole machinery of a civilization's diplomacy depended on your ability to be present and clear-eyed and without visible cracks. She had done this for 30 years. She had negotiated in 11-year cycles and blocked the attempts of 3 separate blocks to cut her people out of their own history, and she had done it while carrying a playing card-sized piece of corroded metal and telling no one what it meant. Not from secrecy for its own sake, from the very specific understanding that the moment you tell someone what something means to you personally, they have a new tool to use against you. She had told me, in a sealed room with the blast door down and the world paused outside. She had told me because I had asked a real question, and because I was the only person in the room, and because she had not been asked a real question in rather a long time. I thought about what that last part meant. Not what it said about the quality of her court, she had addressed that clearly enough, but what it said about the length of the isolation. The very long duration of being in a room where everyone was looking at the Queen, and no one was asking about the pussin. I had been a military escort for 7 years, before that infantry for 15. I was not a person anyone looked at for the human story underneath the assignment. I was the furniture in the room with the uniform, the presence at the door, the name on the protection tail log. And even in that condition, accustomed to being overlooked, I had never had to manage 30 years of it. At some point she looked up from her reading and said, without looking at me, "You are thinking again." I am. The same thing as before? A different thing related. I looked at the ceiling of the medical station, at the gray conduit lines and the ventilation grate and the hanging scanner arch. I was thinking about 30 years. She was quiet. I was thinking about what it takes to carry something that long and not put it down, I said. Not because you can't. Putting it down would mean it stopped mattering. A long pause. Yes, she said. That is exactly it. Nothing more. The quality of the silence that followed was different from the one before it. Less waiting, more settled. The kind that gathers around something that has been named correctly after a long time of being not quite named. At some point she said, out looking up the Veth. The one who stays at the wall. Yes, ma'am. Your grandfather was correct. Your family are stubborn people. He'd be glad you agree with him. A slight pause. He is not living. Died 6 years ago. 93 years old in good health. In the chair on his front porch, it was his preferred method. A good death. The best one he could think of. She was quiet for a moment. He would have liked to know his family name had traveled this far. I thought about my grandfather, about the chair on the porch, conch, of coffee, and the mug of the absolute certainty he carried that the world was a manageable place if you didn't try to make it more complicated than it was. About the stories he used to tell about his own grandfather, who had been a night watchman at a shipyard for 40 years, because he said it was useful work, and he slept well during it. He would have found it funny, I said. He had that kind of humor. What kind? Kind where the situation is absurd, and you find it interesting rather than terrible. She considered that. I find this situation interesting rather than terrible. Then you'd have got along. She made a sound, brief, genuine. That was the closest I had heard her come to a real laugh. Not the sovereign's measured social acknowledgement of something wry, but an actual unguarded sound, startled out of her by something she had not been prepared to find funny. She reined it in quickly, but it had been there, and we both knew it. And the particular warmth that followed it was something neither of us addressed directly, because we did not need to. The 6th hour we heard the first sounds from outside the sealed section, distant, muffled, but unmistakable. The mechanical signatures of equipment being moved into position, the particular acoustic quality of people in protective suits, adjusting their breathing apparatus. The assessment team was staging. We both heard it. We both sat up straighter, independently, the space. Slightly wry awareness that we had been in a suspended state and were now returning to the operational world. Thessera Velsorath smoothed her overrobe and touched her hair. A single pass, checking the state of it, correcting nothing, and set her feet on the floor. She tested the wrapped ankle gently, transferred her weight, and stood. They will enter in approximately 2 hours, she said. I know. She stood for a moment in the middle of the small medical station, very upright, very composed. The Queen fully back in residence. Then she looked at me. When we leave this room, she said, you will file your incident report. Yes. And the legal team's team will receive it, and they will act on it, and the treaty process will shift, and eventually there will be a survey. That's how I see it. And you will be reassigned to another escort rotation by then, presumably. Somewhere else in the outer systems. Probably. She was quiet for a moment. I would like to know, she said carefully, when the survey finds the eye. I would like you to know when it does. I looked at her. You could have your people notify the Corps. They'll know how to find me. I will have my people notify the Corps. She held my gaze. But I am telling you now, so that you know it is coming. So that when the notification arrives, you understand what it means. That they found the ship. That because of a very precise incident report and a very stubborn name, 47 people who were lost for 900 years are coming home. Her voice was level and controlled and absolutely composed, and her eyes were amber gold and slightly luminous. And there was nothing in her bearing that was anything other than a sovereign of the First Order, addressing a warrant officer of a younger civilization. And yet underneath all of it, in the thing that she was actually saying and the way that she was actually saying it, there was a woman who had carried a piece of metal in her pocket for 30 years and was being told, the first time, by someone with the means to do something about it, that the wait was ending. I stood up. I stood at attention. Not the stiff ceremonial kind, but the real kind, the one that means I see you clearly, and I am choosing to honor what I see. I'll know what it means, I said. She nodded once, precise, complete. Then the assessment team's equipment made another muffled sound outside the blast door, and we both turned toward it, and the operational world came back in full. They found nothing wrong, of course. The secondary scanner's reading matched the assessment team's equipment. The bloodline sequence was correctly identified. Quarantine record was annotated with the discrepancy, and the blast doors lifted 2 hours and 17 minutes later. The corridor flooded with light and the sound of people, and the particular controlled chaos of a formal proceeding interrupted and reassembled. Court was there on the other side. Sorav was there, young, stricken, visibly composing himself, and Thessera Velsorath looked at him for exactly 1 second. And whatever she put in that second was enough, because the color came back into his face, and he stood up straighter. She was already moving forward. The summit needed her. The negotiations had been suspended for 6 hours, and the other delegation would be restless, and someone would have used the time to reframe their position. She had work to do, and she knew it, and she was already, behind those controlled amber eyes, 3 moves ahead in the game. As she passed me, she paused, so briefly that most people in the corridor would have read it as a natural hesitation in the flow of movement, nothing more. And she said quietly enough that only I could hear, "The one who stays at the wall." Not a question, not a farewell. Just the name, spoken like a thing being placed in a particular location, filed in a precise position where it would not be lost. I watched her walk into the light and the crowd and the machinery of a negotiation that was about to change shape in ways most people in that corridor did not yet know. Then I found a quiet corner, took out my comm, and started writing the incident report. I wrote it precisely. I wrote it completely. I wrote down the equipment model of the flag genetic sequence and the difference in the readings and the specific language of the quarantine protocol and the timestamp of every event in exact sequence. I wrote it the way you write something that matters. Slowly, with care, checking each word against what had actually happened, and correcting anything that wasn't exact. At the top of the form there was a field for additional notes. A free text field, that most people leave blank because it has no official weight and no procedural function. I filled it in. I wrote, "The quarantine flag was caused by a scanner that did not recognize what it was looking at. The sequence it identified as contamination was not a threat. It was very old, and it had traveled a long way, and it was exactly what it was supposed to be. It just needed a piece of equipment that knew how to read it correctly. That was all." I submitted the report, pocketed my comm, and went back to work. The summit ran for 3 more days. I stood behind her delegation at 2 formal sessions and 3 smaller working group meetings, doing my job, watching the room. She never looked at me during the sessions. That was correct procedure, and I didn't expect her to. But once, at the end of the second day, when the working group broke, and people were gathering their materials, and the room was full of the sounds of a long meeting ending, she passed close enough to speak, and she said, very quietly without breaking stride, "The legal team received the report this morning. Nothing else." She was gone before I could respond. But I didn't need to respond. The statement had not required a response. It was just a piece of information, delivered precisely, filed with accuracy in the place where it would not be lost. 14 months later, at 06:30 on a Tuesday morning, in a transit station in the 3rd outer system, comm produced a notification from an address I did not recognize. A Thesauri legal office, formal header, the seal of the sovereign delegation in the corner. The notification contained 1 sentence and an attachment. The sentence said, "They found her." The attachment was a scan of a metal fragment, slightly corroded at the edges, the impression of 2 concentric circles, and a line through the center. A ship's registration seal, covered from the hull of a vessel designated in the survey records as the Sorath's Eye, Deep Range Explorer, Founding Era, Complement 47. Found intact in the outer belt, at the coordinates the old records had always pointed to, waiting 900 years for someone to look carefully. I sat with that for a while. The transit station moved around me. Cargo loaders and departure calls and 100 people going about the ordinary machinery of a day, and I held my comm in my hands and I sat with it. Then I wrote back, "I know what it means." I got a reply 11 hours later. It was a single line, "Thank you, Warrant Officer. They are coming home." I read it once. I read it again. Then I put my comm in my pocket and walked out into the transit station, into the ordinary morning noise of the outer systems. And I felt, quietly and precisely, particular weight of something carried for a very long time, arriving at the place it was always supposed to reach. The stubborn name, the one who stays at the wall. My grandfather would have found it interesting rather than terrible. He would have been right.